Well, this is nice. I get the privilege of having two back-to-back episodes and half a week. I have not had that for Mythic Mission in a while. And I am very excited to have our guest today join us for episode number 25. We'll go ahead and get started here. Dr. Bailey, I don't know, the one last thing, if we have time, I'd rather you and I get through this material because I think people are going to want to hear it. If you're watching on Facebook Live, feel free to send in a few questions. If we have time, we'll try to have Dr. Bailey answer them. And if not, we'll try to find some way of talking to it or addressing it in some way. So we'll figure it out. But I'm going to try to be prompt here so we can get through the questions and save a little bit of time towards the end. And as I've said, this is Mythic Mission episode number 25. And I've called it Stronger Spells, which I think is the title of your introduction, which I really liked. And of course, this is my guest, Dr. Justin Ariel Bailey. I'm your host, Professor Michael Jahoski. Everybody knows who I am. Let me introduce our guest, and we'll go ahead and just talk very briefly, I will, at least for a minute, about what today is all about. And then we'll let our host, our guest, take it away. So Dr. Bailey is an associate professor of theology at Dordt University. He works at the intersection of theology, culture, and ministry, and his written work has appeared in publications such as Christian Scholars Review, in the International Journal of Public Theology. He is the author of Reimagining Apologetics, The Beauty of Faith in a Secular Age, which is part of what we'll be talking about today. He's also an ordained minister in the Christian Reformed Church. He has served as a pastor in Filipino American, Korean American, and Caucasian American settings. In the show notes for today, I will have a link to his awesome website, where one of the things that drew me to inviting you on the show was that you have a series called Tolkien Tuesdays, and I had to have you on for that. So I'm going to ask you about that towards the end. Definitely want to make sure we have time for that. You've got some really fantastic videos that help your readers dive deeper into your book, which I found were very helpful. And you've got a whole host of other things on there I think our audience will appreciate. There will also be a link to where you can purchase this book, which was published last year with InterVarsity Press, I believe. Is that right?
That's right.
So you guys can go ahead and grab a copy of that. I have it on Kindle, and I will be revisiting it. It's a tremendous book. So thank you so much, Dr. Bailey, for joining us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Michael.
It's my pleasure. Okay, so for those of you wondering what we're going to be talking about today, a little bit of a change of topic from episode 24. We've moved away from ethics, and we're coming back to what my wife and I really founded this podcast for, all about myth and imagination. And I would say, if those were the two words for a great summary of today's show, these are the things I'm going to be asking our guest about today. And he's going to also talk to us a little bit about his book and Tolkien Tuesdays, which I mentioned already, among other things. So if you have questions, again, send them in the chat, and I will try to get to them towards the end of today's show. Let's start with what I usually ask everybody, if they're comfortable with it. How did you become a Christian, and why Christianity? Did you have other options calling you in your life?
Sure. Yeah, that's such a deep question, and everyone's story probably feels so ordinary and yet extraordinary from the inside. I grew up in a loving Christian home. My mother is Filipino, my father is Caucasian. Grew up in the Midwest, and it was just the air I breathed. Went to church every Sunday. It was a Baptist church that I grew up in, and so there are plenty of conversion type experiences, praying the prayer, or going forward, walking the aisle, going to youth camp, things like that. And really, when faith became really real to me when I was in high school, I sort of lost interest in everything else. For a time at least, and thought that, I wanted to be a missionary and tell other people about, what I'd experienced. And so that took me to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago in the late 90s. And my world just got a lot bigger as I lived in the great city of Chicago, where I lived then for almost 15 years. I worked downtown in the Loop, I went to seminary, and then also pastored at two immigrant congregations, Filipino and Korean. And for me, it has always been, my faith journey has always been an experience of a sort of ever widening world. that's anchored in Jesus Christ. So my world was quite small in the beginning. My understanding of faith was quite small. My understanding of I was suspicious of people who weren't Baptists, people who didn't use the version of the Bible that we use, things like that, and so my world just kept on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's continued to be the case. And then I'd also just say, to borrow an image from Lewis, where Aslan keeps getting bigger as Lucy gets older. I found that to be the case as well. The faith has become much more complicated for me the older I've gotten, as the world has gotten bigger for me. But Jesus has also gotten bigger for me too. And yeah, so that's sort of I guess a short version of the story, which includes pastoral ministry, and then also an unexpected decision to go into academia. I never planned to do that. It really was because I had these questions that I didn't have good answers for. Yeah. And so that sent me back to school. I had a master's of divinity, before I became a minister. And then I went back to school to get, a research degree. And then that led to a PhD. And here I am, teaching at a Christian university. So, which I love, but it just was not on my radar at all, from the young Justin Bailey who thought I was going to be a Bible translator in a village somewhere. So yeah, that's the basic journey, and it's full of lots of Lewis and Tolkien, and then later others too. But
yes,
yeah, they discipled my imagination long before I had the language for that. Yeah.
Yes, I can agree with you there, and I won't go into my story, of course, but in the preface of my book, I tell the whole story. The discipling of the imagination is a good way to put it. And I feel hand in hand with that is another theme I kind of picked up from your story. Thank you, by the way, for sharing. Is I think many Christians feel that we have to have this instant, glorious conversion story that we have to tell people. At least some of the Christian, campus clubs I've been a part of here at St. Pete College. There's always this, okay, well, tell us your story. And I felt that there was a lot of anxiety and pressure that if it wasn't this extraordinary story, some of the people I spoke to, I got that sense always that that it wasn't cool enough. And that's so sad. And I guess one last point before we move on is that like my own story and obviously yours, I think there's that incremental growing and widening. I think if you're doing it right, you're headed in the right direction. And I love the tie-in to Aslan from the Narnia books there that you mentioned. That's so true. I found that it's a gradual process converting. We're in the process of becoming more like Christ. In what is in 2 Corinthians, we're conforming into his image every day incrementally. So I think that's very important for people to hear that.
Yeah. There's great things, when you have like an Apostle Paul conversion story, but there's also the Timothy experience, right? The faith that was first in your mother Lois and your grandmother Eunice, and you also,
Yep.
And my children are being raised with faith as well, and again, like you hope that they will continue to have conversions, as I hope I will continue to have deeper conversions towards the gospel and falling in love with Jesus again and again. But yeah, I mean, that was my story.
Thank you again for sharing. Well, I want listeners to and viewers to hear about your book, because it's one of the reasons why I invited you on. I've benefited immensely from it, so thank you. It's helped, I like your phrase, disciple my imagination. And I have to tell you, even in my humanities curriculum now, I am bringing a lot more literature, imagination into the classroom. And already just this summer, huge difference from pre-pandemic. Even just, and I think this insight was from your book, I don't know how you put it exactly, but that we should try to approach apologetics through beauty first and not just hit people with propositional truth all the time. Yeah. And I found just doing art and literature before philosophy and philosophy of religion was already a huge difference in the excitement level, the I understand what I'm being taught level.
Yeah,
it's amazing. So just a sample of how your book has helped.
Yeah, thanks so much for saying that.
Oh yeah,
I could talk about beauty and truth a lot, but yeah, I'll wait and see if there's a question about that later. Yeah.
We will definitely get to it, I promise you. So your book, Reimagining Apologetics, these next two questions kind of go together, so you can answer them, consecutively if you like. why did you choose to write the book? And do you want to give us like a brief overview or tell us some of your favorite parts of the book? And I'll let you choose because I know it's a big book.
Yeah. First of all, thanks so much for reading it and then introducing it to your audience. So the book really came out of my questions and my own personal quest. I was a pastor. I tell this story in the opening pages of the book. I was a pastor to emerging adults in Chicagoland. And I was pretty good at apologetics in the traditional sense, what most people think of as far as like I had my stockpile of answers, to all of the big questions that people ask. And yet I felt like there was this major disconnect in the lives of the people that I was ministering to. In fact, there was a particular student, and the whole idea of stronger spells comes from this conversation I had with a student. He was in his early 20s, I think. And he said, when we're in church and I'm listening to the preaching, it's like you're weaving a spell. He said, you're like Harry Potter, you're weaving a spell. And I believe, and the world makes sense to me. And I know who I am, and I know how I fit. And then as soon as I walk outside the doors of the church, the spell is broken. And I don't know who I am, and I don't know if God is real. And that just really clung to me, that conversation, and really sent me back to school. That's one of the reasons I went back to school, is because I felt like I didn't have a good answer for that. And so that's why I said I wanted to find stronger spells. Like, can I weave spells that don't break so easily once they walk outside the door of the church? And so I was really looking for resources to understand contemporary crises of faith and doubt. And I really became convinced that the imagination had been underappreciated, both the role of imagination in faith, the role of imagination in belief. So if you ask me on an elevator what my book is about, I would tell you that it's about crises of faith and doubt and how they're experienced not just in the intellect, but in the imagination. And so if that's true, and you're having a crisis imaginatively, and I say crisis of faith and doubt, and what I mean by that is one goes one way and one goes the other way. So one is neither atheism nor theism is a stable and safe place to be in our world. We feel what Charles Taylor calls cross pressures, pulling us in both directions all the time. And so a crisis of faith is where you begin to doubt, and the crisis of doubt is where you begin to feel the provocation of faith. And I think that those are first this sort of felt sense that you have of the world. So perhaps as I was, you were raised in a stream of Christianity that was quite narrow and had all the answers. And at some point, you began to run into data or experiences that didn't fit in that paradigm anymore. And so you start to feel like you're sort of claustrophobic almost. You feel like you've been enclosed in this very narrow space. It's not big enough for the things you've experienced, and you need something bigger. And so that's an imaginative crisis before it's an intellectual crisis. So you could spell it out in terms of particular intellectual propositions, but we feel it first before we can rationalize it. So anyway, the book is about trying to articulate a way of doing or approaching apologetics that takes the imagination more seriously without leaving the intellect behind. I don't want to replace traditional apologetics. I want to complement it. I want to supplement it. I want to add something else to give us sort of a holistic view of the way that people come to faith, the way that people struggle with doubt. It's never just about ideas.
No.
Who has the best ideas? Yeah.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, the organization of the book, there's two parts. One is more theoretical, theological, and then the other one is more applied. So the first half of the book kind of gives a history, history of kind of how we got to where we are in secularity, the secular age. That's in the subtitle of the book. And then the second chapter is about the history of apologetics and how apologetics has taken or not taken the imagination into account. And then the third chapter is about the imagination. It's sort of a theological account of the imagination. And then I then take two authors, one from the 19th century, so George MacDonald, who is the one who baptized C.S. Lewis's imagination with his writing, and then Marilyn Robinson, who's a contemporary Pulitzer Prize winning author. I take them as the subjects of chapter 4 and 5, and then chapter 6, I put them together as kind of examples of what this could look like to do apologetics in a way that takes the imagination seriously.
Yeah, it's so needed. And I have to say, another reason why I invited you, I feel a great synergy between your book and my own, because the first sentence of the back blurb I have here many people are rejecting Christianity, not for just intellectual reasons, but because it doesn't engage their imagination. Of course, I'm not the first to say this, but there needs to be more scholars saying this and working on this. It's a crisis of meaning. And I like how you isolated and explained how the different crises of doubt or faith that one has with the intellect and the imagination. I'm not sure that a lot of our listeners are going to be familiar. So we have questions that are going to unpack that a little bit more in a few minutes, but very powerful stuff. And you've mentioned spells. For those of you that don't know, and I learned this a few years back when I was researching my book, and I loved it. The Old English word spell means story. And I loved this idea of, an enchantment, like a magical spell. You mentioned Harry Potter, and I know you've got a great Voldemort reference in your book that I enjoyed. Maybe we'll get to that. But this idea of an enchantment, but a story is an enchantment that casts the spell on our imagination and our intellect that kind of holds us entranced in a narrative, in a well-told story at least. So that was a cool insight for me.
Yeah, I don't know, we could do like deep cuts with Tolkien, but I'm thinking of Tom Bombadil. And why is he not in danger of being entranced by the ring? Well, he has stronger songs, right? He's over there just singing the songs, his spells are stronger, his songs are stronger. And I think that's a very big part of what we're trying to do in discipleship, is to teach, I want to teach my children these songs. I want to teach my children these stories. I want to teach my children so that, the lure of the ring is not powerful or as powerful as the songs and stories and spells that they've encountered.
Very, very second you on that with our kids. Just yesterday, we were talking to our son Lucas, who's 7, and I said something about the kingdom of heaven. We were reading, I think, some parables, and I could see his eyes glazing over. And I said, okay, an image is needed here. And we were building Lego Mario sets. So I said, every day you've got to imagine, Luke, that you're just putting one block into place for the kingdom of heaven. And it's like something clicked for him. Mm-hmm. Images are so powerful. It just instantaneously, in one moment, I don't understand what you're saying. The next moment I do. Yeah. And we're going to get to that. But maybe what we should do instead is just talk about Tom Bombadil, because I have questions. Who is he is the big one. And of course, that has just been driving me nuts for years, which is why I didn't touch that in my book. So maybe we shouldn't talk about it. But anyway, more Tolkien later. Let's get into some, because we'll fall down that rabbit hole for a while. Let's talk about some of those particulars in your book. So I think and correct me if this is not a good place to start, but can we start with just a definition of how you understand what is the imagination?
Yeah, for sure. I always usually start by saying what I don't mean by imagination, because there's a lot of things that we use the imagination to describe that aren't super helpful. And the first thing that I don't mean of imagination as escapist, the thing that you just want to turn off your brain and let the special effects wash over you, or there is a place for that. Actually, there is a place for escape. And then there's also sort of a kind of escape that Tolkien talks about that I'm more after. But I don't mean escapist imagination. I don't mean amusement, not thinking. And I don't mean distraction. What I mean when I talk about imagination is this faculty that God has given to us that explores possibilities in order to fulfill the creation mandate we've been given to unfold the potentialities of creation. So if you sort of think about Adam and Eve being placed in the garden in a space of possibility, and then given the command to now go and take this good start and make it even better, that intrinsically requires your imagination. It requires you to explore possibilities. What if we did this? What if we planted this seed? What if we, I always say with cooking, who figured out coffee, right? Like who had the imagination to figure that out? But just the basic work of human culture, of human cultivation, requires the exploration of possibilities. So that's what I mean by imagination. So I always say, when you think of imagination, think of possibility. And then you realize I'm actually using my imagination all the time.
All the time. Yeah. So it's not just so faculty is a capacity in our mind, folks. It's a function of our minds. It's not just useful. And Tolkien talks about this in On Fairy Stories. It's not just for picturing things, but, and actually I have to read this insight from your book, because this gets into that a little bit. Tolkien, I think, alludes to this too, is that picturing things that are also not present in the primary world or primary reality. And you touch on this a little bit. So I think just before I read this, it's already, I think, very helpful to see how you have presented the imagination. It's going to be very different from what most people are accustomed to. They think imagination means I'm turning off my mind, I'm escaping, I'm running away from reality for a few minutes, not driving deeper into it.
Right.
Which is not really the full picture. So, or even really the best way to start. So thank you for clarifying that for us. So in chapter 3 of your book, this line really hit me. And I have questions later for you about, how can we help our kids understand? I don't know if you can speak to this later, but understand the imagination in this way you speak of. But you say this, you say, to say that the imagination need not be aimed at the real world of what is actual is not the same as saying that the imagination is not aimed at reality itself. It is precisely this ability to disconnect from actuality that enables it by simulation to grasp reality more fully. So the imagination helps us get further into reality. It's the opposite of what people think.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
So
it's a flight to reality rather than from it. When
beautiful.
it's at its best, at least.
Right.
And so that's what I always try to help people see, that you're already using your imagination. A lot of times, though, what happens is that your imagination is taken captive by cynicism or by fear or by despair.
Yeah.
And so if you wake up and you're just anxious about all these sorts of things that are going to happen or that could happen that haven't happened yet, that's a profound act of imagination. Or another example I always use, you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear a noise downstairs. What happens? Well, at least for me, my imagination supplies an image of a person breaking into my house, and it's amazing. It's this profound act of imagination where my imagination is sort of taken captive by fear. And we're always doing that because being embedded in the world as we are, we want to have maximum grip on the world. And so that requires us then to always be interrogating possibilities. What is possible? What could happen? How securely am I rooted in this space?
Yeah.
And it also includes sort of the fantastic imagination of really taking it to the edges of what is possible, exercising the imagination to the nth degree, in search of a firmer grip on reality. In the same way that you read Tolkien or you read Lewis or you read or maybe you spend time in a fantastic world and you actually find that it clarifies your vision. You find that it actually enables you to live more fruitfully. It gives you a sense of coherence in your own story. It gives you a motivation for heroic virtue. What's happening there? Spending time exercising your imagination in service of those possibilities actually infuses your ordinary life with a meaning and a security and a stability that you have because you've been doing that. And that's really a big part of the argument that Tolkien makes in On Fairy Stories, is that, we talk about escape. Well, escape is a heroic motif if you're escaping from a prisoner of war camp, for example. And so if you're always told that reality is empty and it's meaningless, the only meaning is the meaning that you make of it, why would you not want to escape that? In the way that Puddleglum wants to escape the underworld, in the silver chair. And so that's where what the Christian story really does is it expands the imagination by saying the limitations of what can be imagined are no longer the ordinary limitations of human life, because now we're able to, because of what Jesus Christ has done, imagine a life on the other side of death, imagine the resurrection. And you can't hope without the imagination, because the imagination is ultimately the thing that allows you to project and say, could tomorrow be better? How could tomorrow be better? Could this be healed? Could this be changed? Could this be fixed? Can I change? You'd have to, that's imagination too. And what you need is the right food for the imagination, to nourish your imagination so the sort of possibilities that you are dwelling on are not the sort that our culture wants us to dwell on, which are marked by cynicism, fear, and despair, putting us at war with each other and things like that. But the sort of thing that is nurturing a more capacious world, a world full of greater possibilities that we maybe haven't imagined yet.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think people are going to really like this material. Thank you. But they're going to probably have one big question, and I get frustrated in a good way with this, because it's like, we have to unteach almost what our students come into school with, and then, teach them this stuff. Is it all real though? So hold on, you're going to tell me that stories of Voldemort and Harry Potter and elves and a guy who lives in the forest with Goldberry, Tom Bombadil, talking trees. I mean, come on, that's not true. It's not real. You can't say that that's real. I mean, I think that's the pushback we get is, and people alternate. They'll say it's not true or it's not real. So I think this gets into that other faculty of our mind with reason's job is to help us answer that question. So
Yeah.
how can we make the case, and then we'll move on from this, if that's okay. How can we make the case that the fantastical is not useless, that it's real, that it's true?
Yeah, you need them both together always.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis says that the intellect takes things apart and the imagination puts them together. George MacDonald actually is even better. He says that the intellect is the sort of day laborer and the imagination is the architect, or the imagination is the visionary guide that sweeps across the borders in search of new land, and then the intellect is her plodding brother who follows behind. And that's a really different way of thinking about the imagination, is that the imagination goes first and casts these visions of what could be, but then the intellect has to come behind and sort of verify it. The intellect has to come by and test it through experience, because what is imaginable and what is possible are not the same things. I might love the idea of Superman and read Superman comics, but I'm not going to actually think that there's someone who can leap tall buildings in a single bound. So I am quite able to make that distinction between a fantastical world and the truth that I can receive in that sort of a world, and truth in the primary world. That's not a difficult distinction to make. But what happens is particular moral intuitions, particular intuitions about the nature of the world, whether beauty or brutality is the deepest reality. The stories that we take in train our sensibilities in those things. So if I'm always watching sort of post-apocalyptic type movies, zombie things, where everything is just sort of survival, that's forming my moral intuitions in a particular way. And so it's always going to work itself out in a particular sensibility in the primary world. So that's why I would say that the intellect is needed. The intellect is essential in the way that it verifies, it allows us to test our grand visions of what is imaginable. But we don't care enough to test our grand visions unless they've captured our imagination. So unless the danger is not atheism, but apatheism. The danger is not believing in God, but not caring whether or not God exists. And if a person doesn't care, can't see why it would matter that Jesus is risen from the dead, it's irrelevant to give the arguments, right? Exactly. And so what the imagination does is it stirs up a desire to wish that something would be the case. And this goes all the way back to Pascal in the 17th century, who said that, people despise religion, they think it contrary to reason. And so the first step is to show that it's not ridiculous, and then to make them wish it was true, and then to show that it is. And if you just start with a third point and say, well, I'm just going to show you that it's true, but if you haven't shown that it's not ridiculous, they're not even going to listen to your reasons.
Exactly.
And then if you haven't created some sort of imaginative provocation that, I could see why that would be a better world. I could see why that would be more beautiful. I could see why I could have more hope in a world like that. And there's no reason for the intellect to consider the truth value of the Christian faith or the Christian worldview.
What did Lewis say? I can't remember where he said it, but you can't believe a thing. I think it was a letter to Arthur Greeves, his friend Arthur Greeves. He said, "Can't believe a thing while remaining ignorant of what it is." Something to that extent.
Yeah,
and that's it. I mean, you can tout the arguments for the truth and historicity all day of Christianity, but it's not going to mean anything unless you've created that space for that to thrive and exist first. So I think that is really insightful, and I hope people are listening and getting this, because that is really powerful information. And I'm just going to follow up with one thing, and then we'll move into talking about myth, if that's okay with you, because that's another one that people are just they glaze over. And I think it was that people today, we know it's very common. We prize science and reason over the imagination and religion. We say, well, those things can't tell us anything about the world we live in. But do people realize that what Justin's just explained here about the imagination, we need that in doing science too? And then grasping theory and understanding the material world is that you don't not have the imagination there. It's as if some people are under this impression that, well, the imagination's over there for the fantastical stuff, but I don't need it over here for doing science and math. But I think math is all imagination. I mean, not all, but it is very imaginative. Would you say that's accurate, or have I butchered that?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions, where he argues, for this idea of a paradigm shift. And what is a paradigm but a sort of imaginative picture of the way that the world is, an overarching theory that makes sense of things, and you do your interpretation within a paradigm. Until there's enough data that then allows for a paradigm shift.
Right.
So from sort of geocentric to heliocentric, that's like a paradigm shift. It's all wrapped up in a particular picture of the universe or the way that the world works. And I think that people don't recognize the fact that there's all of these things that Charles Taylor calls this the social imaginary. And it's that my intuitive sense of the way the world works and the way that I'm connected to it, the way I'm connected to my neighbor, the way I function in society, if I'm connected to some sort of transcendent order. That's an intuitive felt sense that you don't even examine. It's the water you swim in. And so to deal with the imagination is to deal with that water, is to deal with the soil that you're growing in. We talk about culture, and culture is this agricultural metaphor. Certain plants grow better in certain soil. And so why is it that in the soil of our culture, certain ideas grow better? And so what would it look like then to think of apologetics, to think of Christian witness as gardening? And if you do, you can't just pour water. You have to also think about the soil. And that's what to my mind, that's what imaginative apologetics is it's dealing with the quality of the soil, the space in which beliefs become believable, or the things that are in the soil that are keeping it from blossoming. Yeah.
Wow. Yes. Well said. And before I lose it, let's go back to that point about paradigms and social imaginary. I haven't read all of The Secular Age, and it's this big. It's sitting on the shelf. I've perused it. I've often encountered Taylor through others like yourself, but I'm familiar with this term. But this is exactly the next question. Isn't that really what mythos is in the ancient Greek word? So people, when they take my Intro to Humanities class, there's a whole chapter on mythology. And actually the book does a very good job of saying this without offering a formal definition. So I'm really pleased to report that, because it's not always the case with textbooks. But I think that's probably a good understanding of myth. It's a framework. You mentioned, we've been talking about narrative. I think you alluded to this idea of a big story. So I'm sure you've encountered the concepts of mythos and logos, and we can really just kind of focus on the one if you'd like. But do you see myth as kind of what you were saying earlier about that paradigm, that story? Would you see it as roughly equivalent to that? And
you're right about myth being even more loaded than imagination, because when people hear the word myth, they think something that's not true. Right. And I always like Malcolm Guite, who is a British poet and author, and he says, when I say the word myth, I mean really true, because it's true in a global sense. Like it's true that it's seeking to explain everything, or at least a very large portion of reality. And so that captures it. And there's all different words. In one of the footnotes in, it might be the conclusion, I kind of go through all these different words: episteme, worldview, social imaginary, and mythos is another one that could definitely fit in it. It's sort of this global paradigm, right? The way, again, and it's felt. I tend to avoid the word worldview, because the way that we talk about worldview is almost always composed of propositions, composed of truths. And that's not necessarily bad, but it's incomplete, because we don't experience our worldview as discrete propositions, right? I mean, if you think about scripture itself, this is also another argument I make about the imagination. Look at the way that God has given us scripture. It's all of these different genres which require imaginative dexterity even to read rightly. It's not just 501 Spanish
One,
verbs,
two.
501 facts about God. God
Right.
doesn't give us bullet points. God gives us this grand story of creation, fall, redemption, restoration,
Yep.
in which we find all of these characters trying to live in response to the call of God. And then it says, okay, now this is the foundational story. This is the document that you are going to read your life through. And a lot of our problems with biblical interpretation have been that we've tried to take a very imaginative, dexterous document, one that requires you to really exercise and learn to read rightly, and have tried to reduce it to bullet points and to proof texts. And that's not what the Bible is. It's so much better than that. It's so much bigger than that. And so when you use this sort of word myth, and again, like I'm really careful when I use it with students, because
Of course.
I don't believe that the Bible is a myth in the sense that it's not true, but it is a myth in the sense that it's really true, that it's this sort of globally true. It's making claims about everything. It's making claims about what reality is like itself and what it means for us to live and be rooted in this place. That's really what a mythos is trying to do. It's not, I guess another way of saying it is, it's not reducible to discrete propositions in the same way that a poem is not reducible to an explanation. And Lewis does this as well. He says that in science, you find the notes to a poem, and in Christianity, you find the poem itself. But if you were to think that just by reading the notes to the poem, you understand the poem, you have missed some mythopoetic meaning that is embodied in the hearing of the poem itself, because that's the way that it is too. Yeah.
Yes. Wow. Exactly. Well said. I spent a great portion of my introduction in my book, which I really had wanted to split up into smaller parts of it, such as it is, a very large section diving into this, because it is probably one of the most loaded, more loaded than the imagination. And that's saying a lot. So, I mean, myth is, used in different ways in Greek, but mythoi, then you talk about different kinds of myths, be it parables and allegories and fables, and so it gets very murky very quickly. But I think that's exactly what I wanted to get into. So you touched on the next question as well, but I guess before we switch gears into a new subject, and as we are entering the latter half of the interview here, do you think that Christians should be making use of this idea of myth as like a story that we invite people into, because I've seen some pushback in some circles, when I've mentioned that. Obviously, I think people just get kind of scared at hearing the word. I mean, so how can Christians use this to reach people better, do you think?
Yeah, so I think I'm sort of thinking on the fly here, because I tended to avoid the word myth because, and honestly, I sometimes have avoided the word apologetics because of how loaded it is. Because I remember I taught a class on apologetics in California at Fuller Seminary, and I was unprepared for how antagonistic the students would be towards the word apologetics. I was like, well, you signed up to take the class,
Wow.
But yeah, it's sort of a pastoral thing, right? To discern in the words we use, whether we can redeem them, right? With a particular person, or whether there are other words like story or social imaginary. Sometimes using a new word for an old concept helps, just because it doesn't carry all of the baggage that the old word does. I think if we do use the word mythos, that keeping it together with the other sort of trio of logos, ethos, pathos, and then showing mythos in that sense, because then that gives context to the way we're using the word myth, and that it's not being used in a sort of untrue. So when I say Genesis gives us a creation myth, I have to talk about that really carefully. And I compare it with other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, not because I think those other creation myths are true, but because I think you can't understand the Genesis story without seeing the other sorts of stories that were being told in the ancient world.
Exactly.
And when you compare the two stories, you see that, wow, like the Genesis story is offering this incredibly different picture of the nature of the world being created out of joy and divine excess versus sort of violence. Violence is not intrinsic to, and so I think that there's this, you have to just give a lot of context when you
Absolutely.
use a word like myth. But I think that definitely the strategy of dealing with big stories and getting people to think through,
Hmm.
and what are the big stories that I think about the world, or do I even think there is a big story, or how do
Hmm.
I understand, or how do I imagine my relationship to the world, or to God, or to people around me?
Hmm.
I think, I mean, what you're doing there is you're doing mythos work,
Yep.
and getting people to think about those more fundamental questions, because again, that's the soil of belief.
Hmm.
And in that soil, certain things are going to grow better than others. So that if you just water and water and water with all of your arguments, water also grows weeds.
Hmm.
And so if there are particular things that are just, so you might give people a bunch of arguments, and if they never see the whole picture of what Christianity is, you're just going to grow a lot of weeds, to be
Yeah.
honest, of people just trying to refute all the arguments. So anyway, yeah, that's I
No.
think I say on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's wonderful. And I agree with you. And as you were talking, I kind of thinking of my own teaching, thinking, yeah, I've noticed some of that confusion in using these freighted terms, that just have so much baggage, and no matter how much you can hammer it in, some people still don't get it. So sometimes using a new word to kind of talk about an old concept might be a refreshing approach. And I like what you said too. Before we move on to something else, I want to repeat it about worldviews. I mean, I think of as much as I love Jeff Myers's books for how structured they are, the idea of a worldview with 5 essential or ultimate questions: origin, identity, meaning, morality, destiny, very helpful. And it does help, I think, certain people, who are more rational and logical. But even for those folks, I think that's not how they primarily experience things first, as you said. And so we need to meet them where they are. And I think it was in your book too, where we look at the example of St. Paul in Acts 17, where he did exactly that, where he met people exactly where they are. And I see your point about them being almost sometimes too propositional, and it can be counterproductive. And it's like, I've asked my students, well, think about these questions. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's not the right approach. Maybe we need to say, how would you or narratively structure your life story?
Yeah,
It's a much better question.
yeah.
Do you see because a lot of my students, they're into manga and comic books, and so they'll see themselves fitting into that narrative already.
Uh-huh.
And this character gets me, and now this is how I understand my life in these terms. And that leads me to the next topic about strategies of using, the imagination in apologetics. So since we've kind of talked about why apologetics should be foundationally imaginative, and you can allude maybe if you'd like to some obstacles along the way, but talk about strategies for appealing to the imagination in apologetics. And if you want to along the way, if there's any obstacles you want to point out, that would be helpful. But
Yeah,
strategies, I think, would be beneficial for our audience.
sure. So when I talk about the imagination, I usually talk about these 3 senses. One is seeing, where you're sort of projecting a picture or a hope or a desire towards the world.
Mhm.
The other one is then sensing, where the world sort of impresses something on you. So your body reacts to some exterior stimulus, whether that's fear or joy. And then there's also shaping, which is sort of that mythopoetic making of meaning, that is as basic as my kids playing Legos,
Mm.
or telling a story, or coming up with a play acting game while they jump on the trampoline, that goes all the way then to sub-creation,
Mhm.
where everything that you're doing imaginatively, the purpose of play, again, what is the purpose of play? I mean, there are things that we do just for the heaven of it, just because it brings us joy. But all of those things are helping us feel secure in the world. In fact, that they found in refugee camps that you can tell the health of a refugee camp by the quality of the children's play. If the children play, then you know that things are being cared for, there's some sense of security. Whereas if they just sort of lie around listlessly, that means that all of that imagination, all of that kind of natural human energy has been foreclosed, has been shut down.
Yeah.
So if those are the 3 aspects, seeing, sensing, shaping,
Mhm.
then a strategy would need to engage all 3. And so first you would need to get the sense of, what do they see? What vision do they cast? What would resonate with them? What would be good news to them? That's the question I always think about when I'm talking to someone. What would be good news to this person? And
Mm.
that doesn't mean changing the gospel for whatever somebody wants to hear. But it does mean, in the same way that the four gospel authors give us four very different accounts, or four different accounts of the life and work of Jesus Christ, based on the audience that they're trying to reach. What they're trying to say is, what is good news? What does this audience need to hear? So what is this predominantly Jewish audience that Matthew is writing to? What good news do they need to hear? What good news does the Johannine community of the fourth gospel, what do they need to hear? And so, yeah, that's the first one, is asking what would resonate with this person, which then means you have to know them enough or listen to them enough to be able to know what would resonate with them.
Exactly.
And then the second thing would mean inviting somebody on the outside to see what life looks like through the eyes of faith. Because one of the big apologetic obstacles is that when it comes to faith, there are some things you can only understand from the inside, from a position of commitment. You cannot understand it until you're inside. And so that's a big problem, because you're trying to help an outsider understand something that can only be understood from the inside. Well, how can you cross that divide? Well, the only way you can do it is because God has given us this gift of imagination, that we have the ability to empathize. We have the ability to place ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And when you tell your testimony, for example, that's an active imaginative hospitality that goes both ways, right? That I'm trying to tell my story in a way that you will connect with, and you're trying to listen to my story in a way. And so that requires you suspending disbelief. So you're not listening critically, you're not listening trying to disprove my story necessarily, but you are listening in order to see through my eyes. And so I think that, especially in our times, the power of testimony cannot be overestimated strongly enough, because a life is, a beautiful life especially, is an embodied argument, because it's a person who has integrated this into their life that has led them to live in a particular way that is beautiful. And
I love that.
And that, for people who have all these intellectual reasons why they don't want to believe, and then you meet a Christian who lives differently than you've ever seen before, that's a provocation, right? That's an embodied argument.
Yeah.
And then the third aspect then would be showing what are the new possibilities that faith would facilitate. So how does life with Christ offer a better and more beautiful story? Because what we're trying to say is there's something about this story that it's bigger. It's bigger than the one you're living in. It's bigger and better, and specifically because it's true. It's also true. One story I share in the book was a story that something happened to my wife. So when we were living in Los Angeles, while I was working on my PhD, she was working for a company, and one of her coworkers said to her, why is it that you are raising your kids with Christian faith rather than letting them choose to believe whatever they want to believe? Why would you I think maybe even the word indoctrinate was used. Why would you indoctrinate your kids rather than let them choose what they want to believe? And, whenever you just think of that question, the natural tendency as a Christian is to become pretty defensive. I mean, because it's my kids, and you're like, well, you're indoctrinated too, But what my wife did in that moment, and this is before I wrote the book, so this is just like her sensibility, is she recognized that there was a particular picture that this coworker had of what it must be like to live with faith. So it must be that faith is like living in a cage. And so why would you raise your kids in a cage rather than letting them choose the cage, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
And so what she said is, well, that's not really how we think about Christian faith. For us, faith is the most liberating thing we've ever experienced. And we can't think of a better gift we would rather give to our kids. And the coworker was blown away by that. And she said, wow, I've never thought about it that way. Can you tell me more? And she had never imagined that faith could be so big, so capacious. And all that it took was sort of recognizing the picture that held her captive and giving her a different picture, one in which the freedom that she was seeking could actually be found in a posture of faith rather than outside it. So that's maybe an everyday example of what engaging someone's imagination might look like.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a couple of other works. It's just sounding off some things I remember. Brian Godawa has a book about movies and apologetics, and he talks about this idea that your wife kind of exemplified here, just finding an image or just changing the perspective, telling it from a different angle, and it changes how you look at that thing.
Yeah.
I think the word he uses for it, I know it's often a loaded term, but subversion. It's telling one story in terms of another, which sounds, I think, about right is how he puts it. And that's also essentially what your wife did, is what Paul did. I mean, it's look at this and yet look at it from this perspective, and it's that paradigm shift almost, I think. So it's very, very powerful and very, very everyday, which is what people, I think, listening to this need, is that how can I implement this in my everyday life? And I think you've made the case that we're always using our imagination. So hopefully people are thinking about ways in which we can have these more fruitful conversations with others. It's a very powerful story. It's got me buzzing with all sorts of ideas. So thank you. Very good stuff. I want to save some time in our last few minutes here, as much as I'd love to keep, I've got more I want to say, but I want to look at our time. You have a series called Tolkien Tuesdays on your website. Are you still doing them? Are you going to continue doing them? What's going on with that?
Yeah, it fills me with guilt when I think about all the things I started doing on YouTube that I haven't finished. I started a podcast last year that then took all of my energy away from Tolkien Tuesday, and I was doing it. I was planning to put a whole apologetics course on YouTube, and I still have plans to do that. I've just
Good.
Yeah, with all the teaching responsibilities and I'm writing another book right now and all of those things, it's kind of all on hiatus. But I think I did 7 or maybe 10
I think. Yeah.
episodes of Tolkien Tuesdays. And maybe once the Amazon series comes out, that'll be a good impetus, to at least wade back into that water. Yeah.
I'm trepidatious in thinking about wading into that water. I don't know how that's going to turn out. And
so many ways it could go wrong. Yeah.
I know. And are they still doing the Narnia series for Netflix? Have you heard anything about that?
Only that they had acquired the rights to do it. I mean, my guess is they will. It's a gold mine, but I don't know. I don't know with the estate. Sometimes the estate can stand in the way of bad decisions, and sometimes they don't, so
we'll see how that turns out.
Yeah.
So it's great. So why would listeners and viewers want to go and look at Tolkien Tuesdays? I mean, so what do you try to do there? I know you're going to return to it in the future, and I want to also hear about this new book you're working on, if you can talk about it.
Sure. Tolkien Tuesdays was really a meditation on despair and death and the possibility of hope as explored in Tolkien's works. And it was obviously during COVID tide, lots of reasons to think about despair and death, and so I was hoping to, in reaction to what I would see as something like cheap hope, I felt like I heard a lot of cliches, God's got this, about really heavy and weighty things. I was saying, we really need better resources for saying that there's hope in the midst of times of division and death and despair. And so Tolkien was really where I thought that this is the place we need to look, because Tolkien, better than almost anyone, gives us a world that is full of reasons for despair, and yet there's that eucatastrophe that breaks through. Even if it's coming, it still brings tears to your eyes. And so that's why I felt like I wanted to do a series on Tolkien Tuesday, which really, I would love it if your audience would go and check those out, because I'm quite proud of the, I don't know, it was early days of trying to figure out how to make videos and all of that, but really trying to say, does Tolkien have anything to teach us? And it's really, in some ways, apologetic, in the sense, not that I'm actually trying to, make the case for Christianity, but I am saying, like, let's think and imagine along with Tolkien as we walk through his mythology, and see the truth that we can actually get from this, because obviously, like, he's writing out of this deeply held Christian faith. Not in an allegorical way, but in a way that his narrative has been taken so deep into the soil of his world building that it can't help but come out everywhere.
I know.
And and so that's what that series is trying to do. And Maybe one day I'll get to return to it. Yeah.
Well, if you need help, we're happy to collaborate.
Yeah, that sounds great.
It would be a cool thing to think about. What caught my eye, I don't know, I was surfing your website and I think I saw the one on Amdir and Estelle, and that's the fifth chapter title of my book. And I'm like, oh, I got to go look at that. So really kind of talk about the debate of Finrod and Androth, which I think you also maybe in that same episode.
That's so great because I wasn't aware of anybody else doing work with that. I hope that somebody had picked that up, because I think that's one of the very best things I've ever found on Tolkien is the distinction between Amdir and Estelle. Yeah.
Yeah, and we had Brad Berzer a couple of weeks ago on here, and we talked a little bit about it. I think he's written in his biography on Tolkien pretty extensively about how central that text was, and I had no idea until I had an idea. But it's a really overlooked text in the whole mythos. So glad to see you dived into it. So that's cool. I hope people will check that out. I'll make sure to include the link. So last but not least, tell us if you can about this new book that you're working on currently.
Yeah, so the new book is a little bit shorter than the first book. The first book was maybe 100,000 words. This is like 60,000 words. And it's in the same, it's not about apologetics necessarily. What the book is about is the conversation between theology and culture. And again, part of this is a conviction that the way that we have approached culture is characterized by cynicism and fear and despair. And so I'm hoping to articulate an approach to culture that is non-reductive, non-dismissive, and non-anxious. And so each of those would correspond to faith and love and hope. So non-reductive because of faith, because the world belongs to God, and it's this complex, beautiful world that can never be reduced to one dimension of analysis. And then non-dismissive is a function of love, which means that we can never dismiss the work, just out of hand dismiss the work made by our fellow image bearers. But there's sort of this careful listening and questioning of it. And then finally, non-anxious. So that corresponds to hope, that in Christ all things hold together. And so we don't have to be afraid and fearful in the way we engage culture, as if our cultural failures would somehow put in jeopardy God's work in the world.
Right, exactly.
And so again, to take a line from Tolkien, when at the end of The Hobbit, when Bilbo comes back and he says, you're a really fine person, but that there's much bigger powers at work that are at work in the world. And Bilbo says, thank goodness. And we can say thank goodness too, because the world doesn't rise and fall on us. So that's what it is. It's sort of it's a book that I really have tried to write with my students in mind, those who are graduating and going out into the wider world, and say, okay, how can I think about theology and culture together?
That's so needed. Thank you for writing it. And I look forward to having you on the show again to talk about it. So when it's done. Yeah. Well, we wish you the best of luck in your writing endeavor. And again, thank you for spending the hour with us. And really, I think it's going to help bless a lot of people. And I hope folks have tuned in. I'm going to just check real quick to see if anybody has any questions. And then we'll see if we can let you go. I don't see anything in the chat, but I know I have loads, but we'll have to save that for another time. So I'm happy to have had you for the time that we had. So thank you again for coming on, Dr. Bailey.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. I really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Okay, well, thank you everybody for watching and listening. We'll see you next time on Mythic Mission.